right, so it's April 30th. It's time when I usually start thinking about planting things out in the garden. We're going to save some of the things like cucumbers and peppers, tomatoes until a little bit later in the month, but it's time to start thinking about planting things like maybe some peas, maybe some carrots, spinach, some greens, and that type of thing. And so important consideration is where you're going to be seeding these things, where you're going to be planting them. And so you might have gardens already, but for those of you that don't, I thought I'd chat a little bit about where you might want to plant these things. So I've got these raised beds here in my backyard, and I find they're the most useful for gardening. I've used raised beds of different sizes. Some people like to make them quite a bit bigger so that you don't have to bend over. I like to keep them a little bit lower. These are about 1.5 feet off the ground. They tend not to dry out as much, but they're really convenient because they keep everything nice and compact. Everything's nice and organized. And clean, and I like that when I'm gardening. You also can get around them really easily, and you don't have to be doing a lot of leaning and that type of thing. So if you want to build yourself some raised beds, that's one way to go. They don't have to be this big. These are 4 foot by 10 foot. They could be maybe 4 foot by 4 foot, or maybe even 2 feet by 4 feet. But like I said, I like to try and keep them about 1.5 feet off the ground. I make mine just with spruce, just regular untreated spruce. There's different schools of thought out there. Some people use preserved wood or treated wood so that they don't go bad as quickly. I haven't been able to find real good science on whether or not that the chemicals from the treated wood leach into your food or not. I'd personally rather not take the chance. Maybe it's fine, I'm just not sure. So I use untreated spruce, and it's fine. It might rot after 5-10 years. These have been here for 8 years and they're still holding up just fine. But if they do, they're easy to just unscrew and replace the board. So a raised bed is one of the options, but if you don't have the room for a raised bed, or maybe you're just starting out and you're not sure you want to commit to something like this, there's other things that, you can certainly use planters or pots. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and there's nothing wrong with that. You do have to be a little bit careful though. They are going to dry out quite a bit faster. So you are going to have to water little containers like this, and you have to make sure that you don't put too much in here. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when I do the seeding videos. Something like this might be okay for a small tomato, maybe a couple of pepper plants, maybe 6 or 8 carrots. But you're not going to want to overfill them because, like I said, they're going to dry out pretty quickly, and you're going to have to be watering them a lot. You want to make sure there's holes in the bottom so that there's good drainage, so that the water's not sitting in there drowning your plants. You could use something like this. This is a railing planter that I have that sits on the railing of my deck, and that's good for growing flowers. I usually don't grow vegetables in there, but there's no reason why you couldn't grow lettuce or spinach and maybe even some cucumbers or that type of thing in there. When I get into larger plants, so things like tomatoes are going to get quite large. I suppose if you're growing cucumbers, you might want to use a bit of a larger pot, so you can get these plastic ones that are pretty cheap. They're not that nice to look at, but you know what, doesn't really matter. It does the job, and they're cheap. So something like that would work. Sometimes I sometimes use bigger ones like this too. I found some of these for pretty cheap, sometimes on Kijiji, or people are just throwing them away. And I might be able to get a couple tomato plants and something like that, 2 or 3 tomato plants, maybe some flowers along the front so it looks a little bit nicer. Those are all options as well. Another option that you have is to try and tuck in some of your vegetables in between, if you've got a perennial bed or something like this. So this is my front yard. These are all perennials, these are all flowers. But there's little spaces in between them sometimes, and so what I sometimes like to do is take maybe pepper plants or maybe some onions sometimes, maybe herbs, some basil, oregano, and just kind of put them in between plants where there's a little bit of room. So that's an option too. Anywhere where you have room in your yard. It could be a little planter somewhere. It could be maybe just a corner of the yard where the grass isn't growing very well. You can dig it up, and so you can make do with whatever you have. Alright, so once you've got your planters built, or if you're using containers, the last piece of the equation is what you're going to be putting in them, what you're going to be seeding into. And so there's lots of different options, and there's all kinds of different formulations. It doesn't have to be complicated. If you've built something like this in a raised bed, you might have to order in some garden mix from a local garden center. They all carry garden mix. It's a combination of black dirt and compost, and so that's what I started off with in here probably 10 years ago. Since then, I've been adding a little bit of compost every year. Sometimes I'll add mulched grass or grass clippings like you can see in here. And so that's what I'm going to be seeding into for most of my vegetable gardens. But if you're growing in pots or planters like this, you can pick up any bag of regular potting mix from any of the garden centers or big box stores. And so potting mix is just a mix of peat moss and perlite, sometimes some fertilizer in there. And so just read the bag. Sometimes if it has fertilizer in it, you don't need to add any. If it doesn't have fertilizer in it, you may want to add some. It just all depends on what you're growing. So we'll address that in one of the later videos. If you're growing tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and things that do a lot of fruiting, you might want to add some sea soil or some compost and mix it into your mix that you're putting into your containers. Otherwise, if you're just growing things like carrots or beets, spinach, lettuce, and that type of thing, there's probably enough nutrients in the potting mix that you get at the store for one season.